Hello friend! In this video I'm going to be showing you my process for how to do shading with your hand lettering. We'll be going through which supplies to use, how to figure out where your shadows go, and how to actually do the shading. So if you have ever wanted to learn how to add some shading to your hand lettering, I hope this video helps you. So let's get right into the tutorial. So to start to figure out which pens will work well together, we're going to test out a few different options. I think this is a good idea to do before you get into your lettering because it's not going to be really fun if we create our lettering and then when we go to shade it, our brush pens streak or don't look nice together. So I have grabbed a few that I think might work kind of well together, and I'm just going to do a bit of testing. I think blending with a base of brush lettering can maybe add a little bit more difficulty just because it's hard to figure out where exactly your shadows should go. So I'm going to start with a monoline pen, meaning all of my strokes are going to be the same size no matter which direction they're going in. Now I did make some free practice worksheets that I will upload into my free resource library for you. That way you can practice your shading, and there is both a brush and a monoline practice example for you to try. So if you do want some guided practice, you can head over there at howtohandletter.com/resource library, and I will post the link in the file name of that title in the description box below so you can find it. So the first pen that I'm using here is the Molotow Liquid Chrome Marker. This is really fun to letter with. And then the second is an alcohol-based marker, and the reason I'm using these to start is because they're both pretty quick drying. This is important when it comes to shading because you want the bottom or base lettering to be completely dry before you start to add your shading to it. I'm also using a pretty thick paper, and then I added a second one underneath when I started using the alcohol-based marker so that I don't ruin my desktop. So quick drying isn't necessarily a requirement for shading, but since I'm filming, I do appreciate when I'm using products that dry quickly so I don't have to wait too long. So now I'm just adding a few lines of my base color, and I'm testing them out with some different options to see which ones I like best. It's easy to want to skip this test, but this is kind of the fun part where you can try to get creative and come up with some new combinations that you maybe wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So what I'm going to try to test here is not only whether or not I like the color combination, but also if the two colors are going to kind of mix or streak together. You can also see how different brush pens create different size strokes for shading. So this is also something that you can think about if you want to create a really chunky shaded look or if you want just a slight shadow. There are so many options, but I think that creating kind of a thicker shadow is maybe a little bit more forgiving. So that might be a good place to start if you are a beginner. So next I tested two Caran Brush Marker Pros, and these are really juicy pens. So as you can see, as they sit a bit, they kind of mesh into each other a little bit. So personally, I think I prefer the silver monoline pen at the top. So since I've chosen that one as my base, I'm going to just test a couple of brush pens against that for the shading. This one does take a bit of time to dry, especially when it's got a lot of paint flowing. So I would recommend trying a few different options. Once I added the Caran, I knew that I loved it. It looked really bold and the colors didn't combine together much at all. So once I got this combination, I knew that's what I wanted to use. So I did grab a couple more Caran colors that I thought I'd like, but I'm starting with just one. If you did want to add a couple of different color combinations, you can test them out this way. I'm not really worrying about the sides since I'm kind of just testing how the colors look together. But if you did want to do this with your lettering, you could be a bit more cautious here and then come back over it with maybe a water brush or a blending marker to kind of combine them. So now that we are done with that little experiment, I'm going to show you how I figure out where to put the shading. This can be a little bit tricky to figure out. Like, do you go here? Or do you go here? Or do you go here? How do we figure out where to put our shading? So I'm going to show you how I figure this out on an iPad. You do not have to use an iPad. I just think this visual makes it really simple, so that's why I'm showing you here. Okay, so I have this lettering here. Excuse my lettering, I had not downloaded any brushes that I loved yet, but we are just going to go with it. Now the first step is to pick where our shadow is coming from. I'm going to pretend here that I have a little sun to demonstrate. I personally like to pretend my sun is at the top left part of the paper. You can imagine your pretend sun in several different places. So if we have a sun up here, where is it going to shine light, and then where is our lettering going to cast its shadow? Our sun in this case here is in the top left. Our lettering is here in the middle. So the sun shining is going to cast a shadow right here. So in this scenario, I'm going to take my second layer of lettering, which is going to be an example of our shadow, and that's the layer on the bottom. I'm going to fill it with another color, and again, you don't have to do this. This is just me giving you a visual example of how this works, but I hope that just seeing it helps you to be able to visualize it more when you're doing your own hand lettering. So I have my first and second layer, my shadow layer is pink, and my top layer is black. So now I'm going to take this underneath layer, and remember how I said the sun is going to go this way? So I'm going to put my Apple pencil down here and just tap over a few times. I'm not necessarily just adding shadow to the sides of the letters. That might be a little bit easier to say that the shadow needs to go just on the right hand side of every stroke, but it's a teeny bit more complicated than that. So with hand lettering, there's going to be connections in our letters. So it's not going to be just straight up and down lines that we're working with. We have lots of different angles and directions that our lettering is going in. So all of these little strokes are going to have some shading underneath here. And to me, that is where this gets a little bit tricky. Now, this doesn't have to be where your sun or shadow is. Your sun could be over here, and in this scenario, we could move our shadow just over to the side rather than the side and down. And that is okay too. The point is to be consistent throughout your lettering with where the shading is placed. So now I'm going to go back to my paper and show you a bit of an example. Since I used a brush pen for the iPad example, I decided to use a brush pen on the paper. Using my iPad lettering as a guide, I'm going around this lettering and trying to add my shadows to the right places. Now remember, I have some free printables like this for you, so you can grab those if you don't have an iPad to test this out, or if you just want to print them out and get a feel for how this works. Choosing a lettering style with less curves can be helpful while you get the hang of this. Not that you can't do brush lettering, but for example, just doing a straight line on the first stroke of an H is a little bit easier than doing a loop on the top of that H. Hopefully this will get easier for you as you go. Like everything, the more you get used to it, the easier it should be and the better it should look. So now, using the techniques that I just showed you, I'm going to shade my monoline lettering. Okay, so now I've got my main base lettering, which is an example of one of those H's that I recently mentioned might be easier if you just used a straight line. So I'm going to think about my sun, think about the location of my shadow, and if you get to a tricky part that you're not sure of, I would recommend just to grab another piece of paper and to try to work it out there before you add the shading to your final piece. So since my H was a tricky one, I tested it out to double check myself so I don't have to redo all of that base lettering. Since the first part of that entrance stroke is a bit harder for me, I started with the second part of the stroke. I know that on the downstrokes of my H, the shading will be on the right hand side, and that part I'm okay with. It's that loop that's a bit harder for me. So I'm just going to walk my H through and then come back to that part when I feel a little bit more confident. Another thing to think about is if you're just going to add a thinner line for your shading or if you're going to add a really thick shadow. Either one is great, but my goal is to try and be somewhat consistent throughout my lettering. Here's an example of thick versus thin. The first one is a bit more pointed and thin, which to me is a bit harder with a brush pen, especially if you're used to brush lettering, because your tendency might be to push harder at certain times. If you want really thin hairline shadows, I might recommend trying a gel pen or something a bit thinner. With the second one, I'm going to push a bit harder. To me, the second is a lot more fun to create. I love the bold look, but it's totally just a personal preference. Also, one thing to mention is that because this pen is that liquid chrome look, when I did go over it with my Karen marker, the second color just kind of disappeared off of the silver, and I felt like I could kind of just wipe it off a bit. So this is a forgiving way to do shading if you're not feeling super confident in being able to stop from kind of drawing over or on top of your base lettering. You can see how I'm actually pushing on my upstroke. I know that totally goes against what I teach here, but I'm trying to get a consistent shadow because my original lettering is a consistent width throughout. So I'm not trying to get hairline upstrokes. I'm trying to make my shadow an even thickness throughout. Now, if it's too hard to press firmly on an upstroke, because it is really hard, you can always flip the paper over if you need to. I know I've been teaching you guys to only push hard on your downstrokes, and if that's become muscle memory for you, it's probably going to be kind of hard to push when you're going up. At least it was for me. So if that's difficult, feel free to move your page if you need to. So at this point, I could stop here and that would be great. Except for that I forgot to shade in one side of the E, and looking back at this, I'd also probably bring down the first stroke a bit more at the bottom. But for the most part, I could probably be done. But if we want to add a bit of dimension to this, we can add another step by adding some extra shading here with a gel pen. This is totally optional but fun if you want to give it a try. It's hard to go back and forth with a gel pen, so I would recommend trying to be really patient with this step so that the pen has good ink flow and you're not trying to scrape back over it. You could also try using a fine liner for this step if you prefer. There are a lot of different effects that you can do off of this base tutorial, but I hope that this helps you to get started. Don't forget I have free practice worksheets for you to work on your shading practice in my resource library. I try to add to it every single month, so there are lots of printable worksheets for you there, and you can find that at howtohandletter.com/resource library. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one.